Welcome to the show, everyone. Before we begin our discussion of Plato's Apology, I'd like to explain the format a little bit better, as some of you may now have a better understanding of it. First, I'm going to read a work or selections from a work, and then we're going to talk about it. And the books that I read and share with you are for information and entertainment purposes only. And then, as you'll probably notice, this is my creative content where I go ahead and have a fun, creative conversation with you about it. So, in the future, I'd like to do this in a weekly format, try and get it standardized so that people can know in advance what we're going to be reading next, and have a chance to read and digest and then participate in the discussion or get to the discussion after they've had a chance to actually grapple with the source material themselves. And of course, I've posted resources for you to read along with me whenever I read these works, which I suggest. Now, last time we read the Apology, or Plato's Apology. Now, apologetics is a type of theology or philosophy that is based in theology, typically referring to apologetics in Christianity, which are in defense of. Now, that comes from the Greek word, which is obviously the derivation for Plato's work, Apology, in defense of. So he's not apologizing the way we use the word, he's speaking in defense of. So, again, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this before we read the work, but it is a fictional work. This isn't actually the trial transcript or anything like that. The structure of the Apology is in three forms. There's his defense, Socrates, and then he's given his verdict, and then told what sentence they've suggested, and he's given the opportunity to offer a counter sentence. And then they go ahead and decide what sentence they're going to give him, and then he gives his last statement. So, as the work starts off, again, we'll look at the first line. I don't know, men of Athens, how you were affected by my accusers. It's an interesting and powerful statement, especially as Socrates continues to address his first accuser in this court of Athens, where he feels very strongly tied to the community, since he's lived there all his life, and professes his love for his fellow neighbor, his fellow Athenian. And so it is customary to address your accusers in the order that they accused you. And so Socrates takes it upon himself to address his first accuser, which is rumor and slander. This isn't a person who's actually present. This is probably a little bit uncouth for the proceeding. And it's interesting, his characterization of this. One could call it an argument of a type of indoctrination, because he speaks very candidly about how he's being charged with corrupting the youth. And he's been alive for 70 years, and he's actually a publicly ridiculed figure in the play Clouds, for instance. So to say that people know about him and talk about him a lot is a pretty fair argument on his part. But he talks about how it's been going on for so long that he couldn't even, this injustice that's been done to these people who have been told these, as he puts it, lies about him. He can't even help them redress the injustice because he couldn't even tell them who the people who lied to him, who lied to them were, because so numerous and so long ago was it. And so that's why I say it's a bit of an indoctrination argument. And it's quite interesting. In line 18D, or E actually. So you too then should allow, as I claim, that there are two groups of accusers, those who accused me just now, and the older ones I've been discussing. Moreover, you should consider it proper for me to defend myself against the latter first, since you've heard them accusing me earlier at much greater length than these recent ones here. Sorry, and right before that, what I meant to read was, one must literally fight with shadows to defend oneself and cross-examine with no one to respond. And so, he's sort of explaining the utility, the futility of his addressing this accuser. But nonetheless, he does it, and he, of course, lists it as Socrates commits injustice and is a busybody, in that he investigates the things beneath the earth and in the heavens, and makes the weaker argument the stronger, and teaches these things to others. And these lines specifically, he investigates the things beneath the earth and in the heavens, and makes weaker arguments the stronger. That is referred to continually several times. I think it's mentioned at least 2 or 3 other times specifically in this work, the Apology. And it seems that that's a very common charge, just made haphazardly against people, philosophers and the like. That they're interested, they investigate things in the heavens. Kind of a crazy thing to think about, but here we have Socrates, who's been displayed as somebody who is literally investigating the things beyond what the gods themselves can offer of us as virtue, and looks to the heavens, past the heavens, to what actually virtue is shining forth through in the gods that we can see and then participate in. So, in a way, he does do that, but to just deduce it and say that it's actually a bad thing, that's how this is reduced. And he goes on, and right after he brings up this so-called affidavit of his accuser's rumor, he very quickly brings up the sophist teachers who charge money for their services, and quickly revisits his investigation into the cultivation of virtue, which seems to be one of Socrates' paramount interests. The sophist teachers, he mentions several people, and there's even a dialogue, I believe, or 2, named after these individuals that he mentions here in 19E. And, of course, I think this is the second time right around here is where he mentions clouds again, and I'll talk about clouds briefly. Not only is Clouds is the play that mocked Socrates. Not only is Clouds, but there's several other characters in this dialogue alone who have a specific theatrical presence, as in they're people who write plays, who are currently engaged in public dialogue and discourse. Well-known artists, and they compete with plays. And there's other playwrights who don't agree with Socrates aside from Clouds. that's not the playwright's name. It escapes me at the moment. And so Socrates is quite certainly a well-known figure. I doubt very much that Socrates wasn't a person. I mean, what I mean to say is, I think Socrates was a person because there's no literal way that we could have all of these stories about him, all these different plays and things and references. But the Socrates we know is not the Socrates of history, and it's not the Socrates that these playwrights were mocking. It's Plato's, well, to be quite frankly honest, it's political and philosophical propaganda. But I'll get more into that later. I had an opportunity here to address clouds and some of the background that is the cultural setting for this drama that is the trial of Socrates. Again, he brings up the cultivation of virtue because these men who charge money for their philosophical teachings. Well, not only did I bring up exactly how much they charge. Here's my calculation. More than a year and a half of paid labor. One of these guys charges. Because, using his trainer argument again, let's see, in 20b, Socrates says, Callias, I said, if your 2 sons have been born colts or calves, we could engage and pay a knowledgeable supervisor, one of those expert horse breeders or farmers. We could turn to a fine, excellent horse, seeing but they're human beings, whom do you have in mind to engage as a supervisor? And so he hires this sophist for a lot of money. And we saw this in Euthyphro. This talk of, a farmer's the best person at farming, horse trainer's the best person at bringing about good horses, a dog trainer's the best person to bring about virtue in a dog. And so this is obviously a continued argument that Socrates and Plato will rely on heavily. And as somebody who's practically obsessed with the cultivation of virtue, that's a good thing to think about. In every realm of human experience, in every realm of human endeavor, there are unavoidably experts. And those people have knowledge or a certain way of doing what it is that they do that produces better results than an ignorant person. And that's, very self-evident. But it's an excellent argument in this discovery of the cultivation of virtue. And so, as he continues his defense, he's still technically addressing his first accuser, which is the rumor and slander. And he brings up wisdom, because these sophists are supposedly charging for wisdom, which will bring about virtue. And Socrates brings up the oracle at Delphi, who one of his friends famously asked, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle at Delphi said, no, there's no one wiser than Socrates. And so Socrates then addresses this, proffers his actual own definition of wisdom. And he says, well, I don't think I'm very wise, and so I'll go and prove her wrong. Which, can't stress this enough, Socrates can say that. And again, it's an artistic work. so he'll say anything that makes the plot move. He's a character. It's fine for Socrates to ask these questions, but there is an actual intent behind it. He can't actually hit a lot of his argument or a lot of his presumed innocence, and something that he doesn't address is his presumed innocence. That he's just asking questions, but he's very specific, and he actually has an aim behind it. So he claims, oh, well, I'll go prove her wrong because I'm not very wise. Well, maybe he did think, yeah, I am pretty wise, and I think I know why it is, and I'm going to go set out to prove it. So he does his best to present himself humbly, but it is a presentation. Because he is very wise and pretty virtuous, as characters go. So Socrates says, I'm not very wise, but I know I'm not very wise, so maybe that's the trick. So he goes and he asks the politicians and artists and craftsmen and these people who obviously other people think are wise. And he says, surely next to them, I'll be a pretty dim candle indeed. But it turns out that these people profess to know things that they don't know, and explain things in ways that are contradictory, and Socrates can then deconstruct their arguments in a way that shows how contradictory they are, and this makes people mad at him. And he goes through the politicians and the artists, and he finally gets to the craftsmen, and he admits that the craftsmen do actually know something, as opposed to artists and politicians, which, haha. But the craftsmen do have a specific esoteric knowledge. I think I said esoteric. They have a specific exoteric knowledge about their craft. But this tends to give them hubris, and so they think because they know the best way to carve a table, or the best way to cut marble, that they know the best way for everything. And so Socrates then says, if I could be like them and know what they know and be ignorant of what they're ignorant of, mainly their own ignorance, I'd still like to be me. Which is a very Platonic thing to say. So he actually then arrives at this wisdom, or this definition of wisdom, to say, and it seems that when he refers to Socrates, the oracle at Delphi, refers to Socrates here before you and uses my name, he makes me an example, as if he were to say, that one among you is wisest, ye mortals, who, like Socrates, has recognized that he's truly worthless where wisdom is concerned. And that's actually one of the best definitions for wisdom. It is extremely wise to know how ignorant you are. So then Socrates addresses his next accuser, who is Miletus, who was the person who brought the charge against Socrates. And he cross-examines him about cultivating virtue, because Socrates has already pleaded his case that, he's poor, he doesn't charge money, he doesn't care about things that other people care about, and he causes problems, and that if he were just trying to go along to get along, essentially, or if he were trying to scam somebody, he wouldn't have taken the path that he did, which is poverty and making everybody mad, and then showing up for his trial and offering the defense that he actually believes in what he's doing. And so Meletus claims to care about the youth, who he, supposedly that's who he's looking out for by accusing Socrates of corrupting the youth. And supposedly he cares about virtue, and the only thing Socrates cares about is cultivating virtue and bringing it out in other men. And so therefore he's more concerned about the youth. And he goes on to make this case about Meletus, that Meletus, by using his typical style of asking questions and reducing his opponent's arguments or explanations, he gets Meletus to say that, well, the council of 500 citizens and this jury, which I think was another 500. So he lists in a city of I think it was 300,000 people. He lists about 1,000. He certainly mentions all of the citizens. He pretty much Socrates gets Meletus to include almost every citizen in on, well, these people know how to cultivate virtue in young people. First he says Meletus says the laws are what inform these kids, the youth, how to be good citizens and have virtue. And then Socrates says, well, no, I said what person does it. And then Meletus says, why these people seated before you, Socrates, the very same people who judge you, which is a real pompous thing to do. And no one ever said you were supposed to like Meletus. So Socrates gets him to say, well, pretty much everybody but you knows how to make youth into good, virtuous citizens. And Socrates brings back his trainer argument, his cultivating virtue argument, his horse trainer argument, that if everybody and their grandmother were to try and take care of your horse, only the people who are horse trainers would actually help. Because the other people don't have the knowledge. They don't actually know how to help. And in their ignorance, they'll just make things worse. The same thing with, today, like a mechanic for your car. If you just went in there with a hammer and a screwdriver, you would break your engine. That's why you get a mechanic. And so, do you get an expert to work on a complicated system, or can just any old buddy do it? And by claiming that only Socrates is the bad influence here, he's made Meletus' argument ridiculous, because virtue is a very complicated system. And of course, this was Meletus' purpose and position in the first place, and this is why Socrates so easily shoves him into it. And he said, you are corrupting the youth. And so we're going to have a trial and all this. Of course, Socrates believes that he's the only person actually cultivating virtue, and he has a strong case for it. And, of course, Meletus has made several accusations. And so Socrates goes through them in order, and questions his charge of atheism. And in that charge we actually see you're a strange fellow, Meletus. What makes you say that? Do I not even acknowledge that the sun and the moon are gods, then as other men's do? And Meletus responds, no, by Zeus, gentlemen of the jury, he doesn't, since he says that the sun's a stone and the moon earth. This is something that another philosopher had said, and this guy is one of these people sophist who charges money to be heard at public gatherings, something that Socrates doesn't do. He doesn't do public gatherings. He only talks to people in private, and he never takes money and never offers to teach them anything. He just goes and inquires with them. And then to actually have him being accused with someone else's work that is publicly accepted, while Socrates is not, to allow that person with those views that he's now accusing him with to profit in the city, we usually call this insult to injury. But this is a characterization, I'm sure, more of how philosophers in general were just thrown into the same pot, where if somebody was being done up in a trial like this, they'd just be caught with everything. That, or Plato just wanted it to seem like Meletus was an idiot who didn't know what he was talking about. Either way, we understand that where that's coming from emotionally, that to have somebody claim that you're an irrational problem, and then they can't even get their stuff straight on accusing you, we can all relate to that. Any relationship that you've ever had, you've probably had an argument. Lord knows I have. And you don't like being accused of things you didn't do. So, he's accused this Meletus, who Socrates is, I'm sure, feels has thoroughly proven as a man who doesn't care about the youth, doesn't care about the things he says he cares about, and doesn't know anything about virtue. Now he's confused him with this other man, and has even called him an atheist. And then Socrates points out that he can't have it both ways, that this guy's obviously lying on one front or the other, because he can't say that he's an atheist and doesn't believe in gods, and also that he consults a daemon and is trying to teach people this art of what he calls consulting his daemon. And so he makes quite a cute little argument about demonic activities, where he's what's my favorite? There it is. Is there anyone who doesn't acknowledge horses but does acknowledge equine activities? He makes the argument that he can't consult with his daemon and not believe in daemons. And daemons being supernatural, or of the god, a supernatural subset of the gods, he therefore must believe in the gods, or can't be an out-and-out, outright atheist. And so Meletus is lying, but obviously that doesn't matter, because we know he gets convicted of death anyway. And perhaps Socrates knows this himself, because then he actually starts talking about the fear of death. And how people might say, Socrates, aren't you ashamed to have engaged in the sort of occupation that has now put you at the risk of death? And he says he wouldn't, it's not thinking straight to think that you should give a lot of weight to the risk of living or dying. And then he uses his example of military service, where he served in the Peloponnesian Wars, to really discuss this. How a soldier should stay wherever a man has decided himself to be, has been placed by the god, or gods. That's not what Socrates says, though. Socrates says the god, one, singular. Wherever a man has placed himself, the god has placed him, or his commanding officers has placed him, he ought to stay. And that if you give yourself over to the idea that you should be afraid of your own death, well, that assumes that you know a lot of things that you don't actually know, Socrates argues. First of all, his argument is that who knows if it's a good thing to die or not. Maybe it's the best thing that ever happened to you. Maybe the afterlife's friggin' sweet. But I think there's an argument to it more than that. That is, you're assuming you know how the future's going to go, and that's dangerous. For instance, if you're let's use the military service example. If you're stationed somewhere and you're afraid that you're going to get overrun, you're going to die, and then you leave. Well, your superiors knew that you. Well, your superiors knew you were there, and then they might know that you're not there. Also, you're part of a strategy, so you might have had reinforcements coming. You might not have known about it, and you guys might have won. And you thought your state was going to collapse, and you were just going to be able to live. But now everybody else won the battle. It was super awesome for them. They're all getting laurels. And now the state's stronger than ever, and it's mad that you left. To just assume that running away might be a good idea because you're afraid for your life means you're assuming a lot of things that you don't actually know. And you may be right, and you may die. So to each his own. But this is, I believe, the deeper part of Socrates' argument, although he relies very heavily on the afterlife. But he also refers to, again, there's the mythology of their gods, which supplies and informs a lot of their morality. The story of Troy here, in slaying Hector, the guy who eventually slays Hector, his mother's a goddess, and she warns him, you're fated to die right after Hector, so don't kill him or you'll immediately die. And he says, instead of being here on the beach the next day, having not avenged my friend, that would be a shameful existence. I'd rather kill him and then be dead right afterwards than to be alive and be beaten. And so, though a defense of his life it may be, it's also a defense of courage in the face of death. So, Socrates then actually gives us a little bit of insight into his method. Here we go. Something he's accustomed to saying. My excellent man, you're an Athenian. You belong to the greatest city, renowned for its wisdom and strength. Are you not ashamed that you take care to acquire as much wealth as possible, and reputation and honor? But that about wisdom and truth, however, your soul may be in the best possible condition, you take neither care nor thought? Then if one of you disagrees and says that he does care, I won't let him go away immediately. I'll question him, examine, and test him. So as he's cross-examining the witness and the evidence here, he's also offering up the idea of cross-examination in argumentation, not just in courts of law, because that's what he cross-examines people. And if somebody just says, oh, yeah, no, I care about those things that you're talking about, he's not just going to say, oh, well, good, and let him go. He's actually going to question them. And just like with his, in Euthyphro, where he said, do we just believe what people tell us? And he says, no, we don't believe what people tell us. We ask them about it, and we question, and we try and find out. This is exactly his method, and he's claiming that that's all he does, is just cross-examine people, not offer to teach them anything, none of that. And it's it's foundational for logic as well, and inquiry and reasoning. It's fundamental. So this is as these dialogues are as much an example of how to do that as it is an explanation of anything else. And then he offers his definition of virtue, which is something we don't get often. And it's not really a definition. He says, it's not from wealth that virtue comes, but from virtue comes money and all other things that are good for human beings, both in private and in public life. this is like the superordinate principle I was talking about. From piety, the God's love flows. From piety, the principles of good things that we get out of the gods come out of. Just like if you have, and it's also a refutation of any idea that you can, I guess, buy your way into heaven. But riches don't make you a virtuous person. Having a lot of property, having a lot of physical, earthly power, and this is a huge, huge division that is going on right now in the Greek world, is that the idea of solid, tangible, physical, corruptible things versus invisible, untouchable, unknowable, immortal things. He's arguing that virtue, being one of these immortal things, it's only through light of that all of the good things flow out. So it's not really a definition of virtue, but it later on, whenever we get to the forms, this will seem foundational, because it's where he's dropping in the idea of greater principles shining through our mundane observations. He then changes to defending Athens instead of himself. He makes the gadfly argument where he says, this city and going about its normal routines is like something in a daze. And I'm a gift from the gods, a gadfly meant to cajole you and wake you up, to cause you minor discomfort, to be annoying to you so that you might move and somehow better yourself. And he says, if you get rid of this gift, the gods may not be so quickly to give you another one. I mean, if you kill me, you probably won't have another one like me, which is a little bit different from what he says later. And then he calls his poverty as a witness for him. Because again, he claims he's never taken any money. He's never offered to teach anybody anything. No one ever expected him to teach them something. If anyone learned anything, it wasn't because he promised to teach them or because they paid him. It's because they had an experience that led to knowledge. And that's a big thing for Plato and Socrates. And right after he calls his poverty as witness, he mentions consulting his daemon, which has been part of the charge against him. And this is a very important process for him, and the way that he describes it is very interesting. It only keeps him from doing things. It never tells him to go and do something, which is what a lot of people who commune with the gods, they said do this, they said speak in tongues, this thing. It only ever limits his behavior. It only says you ought not do that. And I think you shouldn't do it. And then he thinks about it, and then he decides not to do it. And that's why he's never entered politics or ever charged money or any of that stuff, because his daemon kept him from doing that. And he talks about how it led him to he has actions to support his character, where in the past there were these 10 generals that after a naval battle, they left to pursue the enemy who was already retreating. And they did that instead of following their duty to rescue survivors and, I think, retrieve the dead. And so they were all tried, and there was so many people that they said, we'll just try them all together as one in a group. And that was illegal. And they later realized it was illegal. And Socrates says, I was one of the people on that jury, and I was the only person who said, no, I won't vote to try them as a group, because that would be wrong and illegal. And it turned out to be right. And even though everybody threatened him and was going to, threatened to charge him with crimes and all this other stuff, he still stood by it. And then later, glad we're getting to this, the 30 tyrants. So Athenian democracy had just been interrupted, and a lot of people were in exile. And he mentioned some people who are in exile and coming back from exile. And a lot of times that's because they had to leave Athens because they supported Athenian democracy. And after they lost to Sparta, there was an oligarchical tyranny of 30 people instantiated to replace their democracy. And so a lot of people had to flee, and it didn't last long either, and their democracy was reinstated, and there were even some improvements made. You know, they had a little bit of reform too. And so these 30 tyrants, they told him and some other people to go and arrest this person. And Socrates just left and went home instead of went to go arrest him because his daemon told him not to. And so this is, I guess, not only character witness for himself, but a character witness for his daemon, who has always told him to do the right things. And it's been proven out that those were the right things because all of these people agree that trying them as a group was wrong and agree that the 30 tyrants were bad guys and did bad things. And they all agree that, you know, Athenian democracy is the way to go. And so they've always agreed with the decisions his daemons made thus far. And so it's as much as a character witness to himself as his daemon. This is interesting, though, and I might miss it if I don't go ahead and talk about it. The 30 tyrants summoned me and 4 others to the Tholos and ordered us to arrest Leon of Salamis and bring him from Salamis to die. They gave many such orders to many other people too, of course, since they wanted to implicate as many as possible in their crimes. That's no joke. Soviet Russia, the Gulag Archipelago, Nazi Germany, Pol Pot, Cuba, Venezuela. This was written in, I think, 322 BC. That's how old it is for corrupt governments. And this was a government that knew it was playing fast and loose. They had just beat these guys. They had a democracy, and they came in and they installed a tyranny. These people knew that they were playing fast and loose. And they, as a matter of course, they got people together to go and be involved in their horrible actions and their horrible governing decisions that were illegal and terrible for everybody, or whatever. That story does not change throughout history, ever. Ever, ever, ever. It doesn't change individually. It doesn't change for groups or nations. It doesn't change for non-profit organizations or non-government organizations or government agencies. This is an old, old story. I just wanted to talk about that for a minute. Okay, moving right along. Now again, he mentions this several times, but he actually takes the time to go through all of it now and claims that he never took a fee or offered to instruct anybody. Nobody ever expected him to give them instruction. If they learned anything, that was something that happened between them and the form of knowledge, as far as he was concerned. And they had no expectation and no legal relationship of teacher and student. Now, if he had offered to teach people things and then didn't teach them things, or if he had offered to teach people things, that constitutes a relationship, an intent, and a type of activity. So it's interesting that he says, no one ever expected to learn anything from me. I never told anyone I was going to teach them anything. They never paid me for it. And this is a legal case. So that's certainly one of the dimensions to interpret this work through. And he says that the reason that he's even popular is because people enjoy seeing pompous people cross-examined. People who don't have wisdom be demonstrated their ignorance. And I think this is true for young people in general. Young people constantly see the confines of their and the restrictions of their society, and not only want to break out of that, they also want the self-evident decay of their society that they see as the young people in the society. They want that to be recognized in the society as a whole. And so what better way to do that and then get somebody who thinks he knows everything and thinks he's all that and so important, and watch him not be able to substantiate a single thing he's said, meaning he can't explain, he doesn't know anything that he purports to know. And that's popular. People like that. We like that, even today. Young, old, everybody. Next, he mentions that there's several of these supposed youths from over the ages that he's been corrupting. Here, now grown up, able to think for themselves and capable of accusing him if they wanted to. But of course, if these people are brainwashed because he's been corrupting them, of course they wouldn't be able to recognize their own distress and wouldn't accuse him. But here's their family members too, who are here. Wouldn't they, not corrupted by me, be testifying against me and calling me a corrupter? But they're not. Why? Because I'm a well-loved person who's actually of benefit and promotes piety wherever I go, is his stance on the whole thing. And then he says, that's all I have to say in my defense. Usually you're used to, and I've seen people come up here and bring their kids and their wife and just be crying and everybody crying, please don't kill me, please don't kill me. And he says that is an emotional display. It is subverting your reason and playing on the part of you that makes your reason weak. And you, as men of law and order, actually have a job to do, an oath that you've taken to judge, not to prefer. And a preference is a more emotional attachment versus judgment, which is actually using critical factors, and you can arrive at answers you don't like. If you're just going off of preferment instead of judgment, preferment will always make sure that you like the outcome. And so he essentially condemns anyone who would use emotional arguments. And that's something that happens a lot around you. You should look for that. And this is one of the reasons I'm doing this, to be quite honest. If somebody's arguing to your emotions, it's because they don't have a reason for you. And they know that you are more likely to agree with them emotionally than disagree with them rationally. And Socrates makes the point right here that they'll use that to trick you, to lie to you. That's how you get that. That's how you get that lie across, is you play up the emotion. And he says that that if anybody does that, tries to make an emotional appeal to you on matters that are truly important and of virtue and of piety, you should be insulted that they thought that would work. Interesting to know. Again, 300 years before the current era, all this stuff was already written down. And then, right before his defense rests, he talks about the reputation. He says, this is going to be on you all if you kill me. I'm a 70-year-old man who just bothered you by asking questions, and this is how you're going to treat me? I really hope that you don't get judged the way you should be judged for that. So, he insists that he believes in deity and that he is only concerned with virtue, and that in some point in there, he said Meletus should have taken me aside and offered me instruction, because if I did anything wrong, it's unintentional. And again, he makes the argument about that we saw in the Euthyphro about the intentions of bad men, or men will bad man will say anything to get out of, or men will say anything to get out of, their court responsibilities, or to take responsibility for the people that they've harmed or whatever. And Socrates says, well, they'll say anything. Will they say that they did a bad thing and that you shouldn't punish them for doing a bad thing? He's like, no, they'll argue over what they did was bad. So I think that's kind of a little bit of a callback where he talks about his unintentionally doing it. It's a little bit of a callback to that idea of the intention of evil, because if you had to intend to perform evil, to do evil, nobody'd do evil and we'd all be good forever. And that would be really happy. And if you didn't notice, that's not the way the world is at all. No one's happy ever. So, we must live with evil in a world where you can do evil and not intend to do evil, or do bad, or do harm. You can notch it down from evil if you need to. So, Socrates' defense rests, and everybody should take a break, because we've talked really long, but we're almost done. So, I'm in favor of a rest, to be honest. So his defense rests, and they decide that he's guilty. On which charge, on which count, how so, we're not told. Theoretically, he made a great defense, but they found him guilty, however. So then Socrates is convicted, but it's by a small margin of the vote. The votes mentioned and numbered out. The idea inherent there is that Meletus had to get, if he had not gotten Archon and this other gentleman, Lycon, to accuse with him, then they would have held a vote to see if this was going to happen, and instead of the trial already proceeding the way it did. So the way it happened is these three guys accused him in this official proceeding, which led to a trial. If it had just been the original guy, who it still seems to hinge upon, if it had just been the original guy and no one had supported him, they would have had to have had a vote, and he wouldn't have gotten the numbers for it to proceed, and he would have been fined for bringing a false suit. That's not the race they were running, though. They were running the is he guilty race, and Socrates, other numerical considerations aside, lost that vote. But he claims he only lost it by about 30 people. Out of 500, that's not that bad. I guess it is if you're being sentenced to death for it. Maybe it is that bad. So he's fined, or Meletus would have been fined given the vote. But that's not the way it played out. And so Socrates is now given the opportunity to offer a counter penalty. And he says, well, in light of everything that I've done, I think my penalty should be free food from this place that if you win a chariot race, they give you a free meal. Because I need the food more than those guys do. I'm poor, and I've sacrificed all I have to the virtue and betterment of Athens, the people, and the city. And in light of that, I think I should be sentenced to free food. Which is cheeky. But he refuses to. They want him to say exile. They want him to say exile. But he's not going to do it. And that's made clear. He could just leave off with the tongue-in-cheek answer, free food. But then he goes on, he says, exile isn't an option. I'm not going to stop. Or if you were to say to me, hey, we'll drop the case if you just stop philosophizing. He says, I'm not going to do that. And if you kick me out of here, I'm going to philosophize wherever I go. I'm not going to stop there either. And they'll kick me out, and they'll kick me out, and they'll kick me out, and it'll just never end. Here I am, 70-year-old, at the end of my life. I can't just do that. I'd rather die. I'd rather you just kill me here and let me die here. So exile is not an option, and he won't stop exhorting. And then, as kind of a final slap in the face, like, you can give me free food. I'm not going to suggest exile, and I'll tell you why it won't work. If you're thinking it would work, here's exactly why it's not any kind of mercy that you'd be bestowing upon me. It's just the same BS that you should take responsibility for, that you don't like the way you're living your life, and I just told you facts that made you realize that. Then he says, I'll even pay you all the money I have. Exile's off, free food, exile's off the table. I'll even pay you all the money I have, which is, I think, something like 1,000 silver drachmas, which is 1 mina. And then Plato and somebody else speaks up and says, hey, look, we'll throw in some money for you. Plato's very rich and comes from a politically affluent family. I believe two of his... It was either two of Socrates' or two of Plato's family members were actually members of the 30 Tyrants. But both of these individuals had opportunities Plato and Socrates had opportunities to be very politically active, and they both chose not to be. And instead pursue philosophy. So his friends say, make it 30 minas. 30 minas is 3,000 silver drachma. And again, a drachma is pay for a day laborer. So this is literally over a decade, longer than Socrates has left to be alive. He's not going to make it to 80. And he definitely doesn't, because he drinks the hemlock. A decade, which is more than he has a decade of paid labor. Every day, no days off. Offering to pay that. Or you could give him free food. He could pay you 10 years of labor that he is not even going to produce. He could pay you that. You could give him free food, but he's not going to do exile and he's not going to stop philosophizing. So he gave them options. He was like, you could be greedy and just take all the money, because that's a lot of money. Or you could do the right thing and take care of me a little bit. But I'm not going to give you what you want. You're going to have to decide to kill me, decide to do the right thing, or prove that that you could be bought off. That you're not actually virtuous. It's quite the logic trap. And then he's sentenced to death. They decide not to go for the free Happy Meals, strangely enough. He's sentenced to death, and he stands behind his defense and not appealing to emotional arguments and not being afraid of death. This is a particularly interesting little paragraph, so I'm going to read through it. You see, whether in a trial or in a war, neither I nor anyone else should contrive to escape death at all costs. In battle, too, it often becomes clear that one might escape death by throwing down one's weapons and turning to supplicate one's pursuer. And in each sort of danger, there are many other ways one can contrive to escape death if one is shameless enough to do or say anything. The difficult thing, gentlemen, isn't escaping death. It's escaping villainy is much more difficult, since it runs faster than death. And now, I, slow and old as I am, have been overtaken by the slower runner, while my accusers, clever and sharp-witted as they are, have been overtaken by the faster one, vice. I just love that idea. Villainy runs faster than death. That's something to remember. That is something to remember. And then he offers a prophecy because he says, this is when all the good prophesying happened, guys, right? Before somebody dies. He says that you're going to be cursed, which is why I said he kind of contradicts himself later about the whole gadfly argument that they won't be blessed with another one, because now he says you're going to be overrun by people who are going to be way worse than I was, and I was keeping some of them at bay, and you may not have even known about it. But now they're going to be your problem, because Socrates ain't going to be around for you to kick around no more. And I can't help but wonder if it's not a minor allusion to the underlying political reality that's going on, and maybe it was the anti-Athenian Democritists that I was kind of keeping at bay and being like, no, democracy's not that bad. We need to go for reform, blah, blah, blah. He's not going to be around to make them not cause real trouble now for the democracy. And we're going to get into that very shortly. And there's not a lot to go into, but we're almost done with this. And then he offers to discuss, he says, everybody who voted to convict me, it's your fault. They're going to say that you killed Socrates, and they're going to say I'm wise, even if I'm not. Your accusers, you've just given, because if I'm not wise, if I actually don't know what I'm talking about, this is not worth it. And you've just made your enemies able to mock you for killing somebody who there's no reason to kill. You look like barbarians, essentially. It says, but to everybody else who what was it, voted to supplicate? I forget. Anyone who voted to acquit, he says, let's talk. Let's take this opportunity. We have the chance. Let's talk. If you want to discuss, what's going on. And then he talks about his daemon, and he says his daemon's always bothered, this is more to his pupils. His daemon's always bothered him, even with minuscule tasks. It's always told him not to do things. He says, but today, waking up this morning, coming down here, giving my defense, it never spoke up once, which means everything I did was good. And so don't cry for me that I'm going to die. It's probably a good thing. It's probably a really good thing. And then he mentions all the heroes and all of the great poets and philosophers and lawgivers and kings that he's going to get to talk to. And this is going to be a place where they don't kill you for asking questions or seeking wisdom. So that's going to be great for him. Death's not so bad. And then he offers his forgiveness to those who have done this to him, who have wronged him, falsely accused him, and judged him harshly. He says, I forgive you because this is a good thing for me, because I'm assured by my daemon's silence that I'm actually on the right path right now. So that's fine. But you meant to do me harm, so you all suck for that. So no forgiveness for that. All blame for that, because you were trying to hurt me. But I just forgave you, so... But I want you to know why I'm disappointed in you. I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed, and I want you to know why. And then he says, just sentence me to one more thing. Just whenever my sons grow up, question them the same way I've questioned you. It's a good sentiment. I'm going to read it because this is the last paragraph of the whole thing. Second to last and last. This small favor I ask of them. When my sons come of age, gentlemen, punish them by harassing them in the very same way that I harassed you. If they seem to you to take care of wealth or anything before virtue, if they think they're someone when they're no one, it's a mean thing to say about your kids, reproach them just as I reproached you. Tell them that they don't care for the things they should, and think that they're someone when they're worth nothing. If you will do that, I will have received my own just deserts from you, as will my sons. But now it's my time to leave, I to die, you to live. Which of us goes to the better thing, however, is unclear to everyone except the god. So that was the synopsis of Apology. I'm sure you noticed, because it was long. So I'd like to talk about reductio ad absurdum, which is the type of argument that Plato uses through Socrates here. What you do, and this is the Socratic method, is you use counterexamples to prove that it's absurd or ridiculous what your opponent's suggesting. Now, this is also used for a proof by contradiction, which is one of the strongest, most amazing proofs there is. Didn't know I was this passionate about logical operators, did ya? Proof by contradictions, insanely powerful and extremely reliable. Reductio ad absurdum, great. It's awesome. And it's the Socratic method. So I really appreciate the Socratic method. I kind of like Socrates. Not a big fan of Plato. And I'm sure that'll come out later. Now, I mentioned the sophists in the first discussion, and that's going to get messy soon. In our last discussion, I mentioned the sophists, and I talked about them as rhetoricians, but soon we're going to see Aristotle come out, and, he's a philosopher, but he's going to distinguish the branches of philosophy, natural philosophy, epistemology. He's going to start actually what took almost all of Greek's time to really just lay foundations for epistemology and all these other things. Aristotle's going to come out and just divide up philosophy into all of the branches of science we're more familiar with today. And so sophistry was that before Plato and Aristotle. So sophistry was natural philosophy. It was geometry, it was mathematics, it was rhetoric as well. It was all kinds of things. It wasn't just rhetoric. There were naturalists, there were logisticians, there were mathematicians, there were geometers. However, we are confronted in this dialogue particular with a group of sophists who are specifically engaged in teaching rhetoric to people. And so, as far as the sophists go, I didn't want to paint them all with a broad brush, kind of like I did last time. I wanted to go ahead and clarify that, because I realized that probably wasn't the best information of me to give to you. But Socrates was against rhetoricians. And which was going to bring me to my next point, which is the political reality of Socrates and Plato. Apology's fine and good. Probably not what he was charged for, and probably not how the trial went. The trial probably went like this. You've been preaching against democracy and against our system of government and proposing something kind of like an oligarchical structure of a group of select elders, you call them philosopher kings, a group of people who should rule the city, which is what we had before we had democracy, and which is kind of like the tyrannical oligarchy that the Spartans came in and put in, and we just had this, there's all these rebellions going on, and all of these people trying to upheave the political power in the state. And Socrates was right smack dab in the middle of that, and a lot of the stuff that he talked about in private that we don't hear a lot about was these very real political issues. And it comes out more later in the Republic what exactly this would look like, but we don't think it's Plato's philosophy inherently, and we don't think it's just Socrates. So Socrates started it, Plato refined and made it his own. And then Aristotle will come on and, write Nicomachean Ethics. I'm getting ahead of myself. But man as a political animal is certainly being dissected here. And this trial was probably more about that. And I'm not saying he was guilty. I mean, he probably, he may have just, said, well, this is the best, this I theorize would be the best way of government, but I'm perfectly happy with our government the way it is now, so long as nobody does anything illegal or whatever. But they also were in fear for their democracy. So the trial of Socrates probably had a lot more to do with that. And this is why I refer to Socrates as a mythological figure. Not a lot's known about him. There's these mythical stories that we have about him that portray in this theatrical way these intense emotional events. I mean, this man's dying, and he has nothing to his name, and his friends offer a fortune for this poor man to please be. I mean, what an emotional argument in a piece where you say that emotional arguments aren't good. What are you doing, Plato? So that's why earlier I called it a piece of political and philosophical propaganda. Not that it's not useful, not that it's not good, not that I don't like it. It just kind of is. In his gadfly speech, he's kind of, nothing like this exists, but he's although it kind of does. There's already a sacredness about citizens in the democracy that they have a right to be heard and a right to speak and a right to engage in their government and engage in their society. And so Socrates is just saying, I have every right to just talk to people. I'm not hurting anybody. And so it's an interesting argument for individualism and free speech. Now we're getting into the things. I've read these stories a lot. I know a lot about them. I've gone through plenty of the historical and other twisting alleyways before. And these are some of the things that really interest me now. And that's looking at this proto individualism right here and relating it to kind of our present day issues with freedom of speech, which there should be no issue with, but that's a different story for a different time. If you're just going to put people to death for talking to people, then what is virtue, and why do we have a society anyway? Why would anybody trust you to do what's good for anybody if that's what you walk around thinking? Is the gadfly argument. However, Plato's a collectivist. So for me to read this in here isn't that strong, but it still seems to be there. Plato's a collectivist. He thinks people should sacrifice everything about themselves for the society, and Socrates, for all we know, was too. So that's an example of some of the things that are interesting to me. The fear of death and the pursuit of virtue. I thought that was pretty good. It's one of the reasons I decided to include the apology is because it absolutely has some great arguments for how to live your life and for principles for navigating virtue or orienting towards piety. Because I think his argument about death is absolutely inherently essential to anyone trying to do anything that's of worth to anyone. You can't be afraid of the unknown that the future holds. And pursuing virtue as opposed to pursuing material wealth, well, that's just an idea I get behind. It's one of the things I like the most about Western civilization, along with individualism. How about that? So now you have a little bit more information as to maybe why we're starting off at the beginning of Western civilization with the beginning of the ideas of Western civilization, because maybe that's where this particular reading list of philosophy is going. And maybe you're just getting educated. So Socrates' daemon's really interesting. I think last time I called it like a proto-consciousness, and that's because it doesn't tell him to go and do things. It tells him not to do things. If you're doing something, a great example, if you're working with a power tool, and like that moment right before you save your life or right after you save your own life, and you probably know what I'm talking about, you were about to do something really stupid, and then you didn't because you were like, oh, I should do this so I don't die. That's kind of what I think of as this, like, hey, don't plug that power saw in yet. You're missing something. Oh, right. I should secure this. But if I characterize it like that, then it actually proves his atheism, which is not the argument that he's making. Which, who knows? Maybe he's being a little sly. Because he never says, I don't think he directly says, I'm not an atheist. He says, you can't prove I'm an atheist, which is actually would be a great defense for him if he was. Is you look, you can't prove I'm an atheist. And it's like, oh, well, you don't believe in gods. Well, I believe in these things, and those are what everybody says those are from the gods, and I don't dispute that. I just choose to talk about these things instead of the gods. So prove I'm an atheist. It's pretty clever. But here's something that really interests me. Again, I've read through these several times at different times in my life. Things that still interest me. The Oracle at Delphi. The Oracle at Delphi just interests the heck out of me. There's a proto mystery religion of it's sort of like a naturalist religion, and they worship Python. Pythagoras was Sicilian. They worship Python, different. They worship Python, who's a snake that lives in the navel of the world, which is this hole, or this crack in the earth, which is where the snake Apollo showed up, because after this was a naturalist proto-mystery religion. Of course, the Athenians showed up, and then obviously Apollo showed up and did a thing. And they still used the holy spot, but now it's because of Apollo. So Apollo comes and kills Python, the god, the snake god, and his body falls into the crack or the crevice, and the body decomposes forever, and as it does, these fumes come up and they cause hallucinations. It's thought that the Oracle of Delphi was using certain types of drugs, or that there was a natural gas shooting up through this crevice that would cause that was toxic and would cause hallucinatory or epileptic fits. And of course, the priest there would write out lines of poetry about whatever thing the oracle was doing. So the propheticness of it, not really there. Still interesting. But this is really, it's Socrates refers to the god there, the god at Delphi. He doesn't say Apollo, and he says the god a lot in this piece. Never says Apollo. He could say Apollo. He could say the god Apollo, or Python, who was slayed by Apollo. He doesn't say that. He says the god. They both have names, Apollo and Python. And if Apollo's not there, it's the winter months, Dionysus does the prophesying through the oracle. And if you didn't know that, and you haven't read Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, you wouldn't be able to make that connection anyway. We'll get to it. Apollo and Dionysus were twin gods. They were hermaphroditic, somewhat Gnostic representations of yin and yang. One and the same god. And that's a very, very common black and white juxtaposition god mythology that crops up all over the world. So that's the stuff that really interests me. Apollo and Python and the Oracle of Delphi. And here's something else that I thought of while I was doing this. I looked up a Pareto distribution and tried to apply it to Athens. And I've been interested in Pareto distributions for a little bit, but I just very recently found out that it governs things like tree growth and I think even bacteria colonies. Like, there's almost no end to what Pareto distributions affect. And if you don't know what a Pareto distribution is 80-20. And it was originally discovered by or developed by Italian economist named Pareto, who found out that the material wealth of a society or the production could be derived in an 80-20 relationship. And this occurs almost like a natural law throughout all kinds of different production-based, especially materially producive stratas throughout all different categories and things, and nature and human activities. It was originally, like I said, an economic for wealth distribution. But we see that it covers all kinds of other things. And I thought that it was a square root relationship, but I found out that it's 80-20, and I'll have to do some more research into that. But Athens was kind of an artificial Pareto distribution, which may be why it was so unstable. But you had a third of the population who were property holders, and then you had about a third of those who were actually men over the age of 30 and able to vote and actually participate in government and all of that. So I thought that was really interesting. I'm going to be doing more little in-depth things like that. But we're coming up just about on the end here. And if you can't tell, my voice is a little tired. So I'm just going to go ahead and wrap it up. And one thing I wanted to talk about was the argument for the soul and death and the afterlife. And it's actually the reason that we're not going to be reading the Phaedo next. The Phaedo is actually a really good work. I like it. But it is mainly for argumentations for the immortality of the soul. And that causes more controversy than it does actual interesting conversation. So I'm just going to skip it and go straight to the Meno, which I think is more interesting and talks about actually the theory of knowledge and Plato's or Socrates' theory of remembering, which is used in his argument for the immortality of the soul, but it's actually a demonstration of the acquisition of knowledge. That's much more interesting to me, and I think we'll get a lot more out of it. So we're skipping the Phaedo, and we're going to the Meno next. That's going to be our next work. Actually, as a correction, we will be going over Crito next. But the Meno will be right after that. So I'm adding this addendum in because I'm re-recording. I absolutely forgot that we're going to the Crito next, and then the Meno. So, all that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for listening. tell you to have a good night. And God bless each and every one of you.